opposed to having the lyrics and having the composer set the lyrics. You know, I think I think Elton John used to write the music and then they'd write the lyrics. Bernie Taupin write the lyrics to it. So, you know, I think they're different approaches, but normally the libretto is written first. However, the composer modifies the text through musical repetition, emphasis, etc., so that the librettist isn't necessarily writing, please repeat these words, or please emphasize these words, or please stretch out these words. But however, especially in particular to the more 17th, 18th, and even through the 19th century, librettists were expected to use certain words that you would expect the composer to make hay with. But again, based on the techniques of what we expected for an opera aria or duet or quartet, you know, again, repetition might be expected. Wouldn't necessarily be designated in the libretto, but the composer would be expected to repeat the music. So early librettos were based on mythical themes. So the Rinuccini, Daphne and Eurydice, as well as Stridio for Orfeo. The early ones often took on mythical themes. And they often took Greek and Roman stories. If it were an oratorio, it might use biblical themes, but typical was using mythical themes. In the 18th century, one of the great librettists was Pietro Metastasio, who wrote 27 opera seria libretti. His texts, not just the librettos, but in general, the texts were set by over 400 composers. The first anthology of his works were published in 1733. So, and he wrote libretti well into the 1770s. So even by 1733, his works were considered worth publishing. And again, the same librettos could be set dozens of times by dozens of composers over the years. By contrast, librettos as text, oftentimes librettists work with specific composers. A composer might really appreciate the style of the libretto. They work together well. And so we have some examples here of Da Ponte and Mozart, Romani and Donizetti, Piave and Verdi, Hofmannsthal and Richard Strauss. Probably the most famous pairing would be Gilbert and Sullivan in a different genre, but again, one writing the lyrics and the other writing the music. Very typical to have these kinds of pairings. And you had composers who wrote their own librettos. Berlioz, Wagner most famously, Mussorgsky, Debussy, at least for Pelléas, and Alban Berg for Lulu and Wozzeck. By contrast, librettos as object, that is, as not talking about the words to which the opera was set, but in this case, talking about the books. Richard McNutt in Grove Music Online, and this is a little long, but let me read it out. A printed or manuscript book giving the literary text, both sung and spoken, of an opera or other musical work. For 3 centuries, the principal purpose of the published libretto was to provide for those attending a performance of an opera the text and a list of the characters. A new libretto was customarily printed for each production, and was available before the first performance. And I think this is particularly interesting to realize when we think about a libretto published now, most often is published by the same publisher as the music, and it is just a collection of the words. Early librettos had a context. Early librettos were meant sort of as we would consider a playbill today. So they are interesting artifacts of their own about the performance of that particular work. So if we look at this Daphne, example of Daphne from 1598, we see arguably the first performed opera. We see here that the composta is not the musical composer. The composta is the librettist, and then set to music by Corsi. But it does not name the co-composer, Jacopo Peri. And there is no cast list. So the first libretto for the first opera names the librettist first, the composer second, doesn't name all the composers of the work, and there's no cast list. By contrast, this libretto from 1837, and I wrote out the title page here so that everyone can see it, music by Bellini. So by 1837, it's the composer who's listed first. Names the theater, the King's Theatre, Haymarket in London. This is for that April 1837 performance, which was the first performance of the opera in London. It mentions who designed the sets, Mr. William Grieve. Names the librettist and names the translation. So this book not only has the libretto in Italian, it also has an English translation for them to follow. This one lists the cast. Who are the cast members? Just like a playbill, list the cast at that performance. These were the singers for the major roles. They also happened to be the singers of the premiere in Paris in 1835. So again, we're getting some more than just the text information from this book. We're getting information about the specific performance for which this libretto was published. Then, of course, what follows are the Italian and the English translation facing one another, followed by, and this I love, followed by the refreshments that were being served at the King's Theatre in 1837 in, as you can read a little bit here, in the French style. So these were the kinds of treats that you might be enjoying in Paris. They are serving them for you in London. So the first list, it's very small, but it mentions bonbons. They're all French desserts. And you can have your cup of tea, your glass of jelly, or your glass of hot jelly, whichever you goes well with I Puritani. The complexities regarding cataloging librettos, the questions that one would ask is, how do I catalog this? How do I classify a libretto? How do I determine the main entry or preferred name of the creator? And how would I want to collate these librettos in my catalog? So there really are, when it comes to printed collections of librettos, there are two sort of standard setters. One was Oscar Sonic, who was the head of the music division at the Library of Congress from 1902 to 1917. In 1908, he purchased the Schatz collection of about 12,500 opera librettos, from which he published the Catalog of Opera Librettos printed before 1800, published in 1914 in 2 volumes. So let me show an example of something that appears in the sonic catalog. So the Rinaldo libretto, this is an opera by Handel. It was Handel's first Italian opera for the London stage. So we note, again, doesn't matter that Handel was, pretty well known as a German composer at that time. Still, in the older style, the name of the composer, or the librettist in this case, does not appear on the title page. However, there is a letter from the librettist, Rossi, describing the composition of the libretto and his work with Handel for the music. This is the sonic entry. Sonic is actually not describing the actual libretto from 1711. He's describing the 1760 reprint, because that is what he had from the collection of Aaron Hill, who himself was a dramatist and impresario of that theater and translated Rossi's text into English in that libretto. And here, by contrast, is the separate index for librettists, and here's the entry for Rossi. The last one is the one that we just saw from the 1760 reprint of the 1711 libretto. The next major publisher of a print catalog came from Claudio Sartori, 1913 to 1994. He was a musicologist and librarian, first centered in Bologna, and then for the end of his career in Milan. And his catalog is in 7 volumes. Also, coincidentally, not coincidentally, is a catalog of librettos published before 1800. So 1800 always seems to be the cutoff for these books, with 16 indexes, which is tremendous a resource. So here's the entry for Rinaldo in Sartori's book, and it lists various, at the very bottom, lists various libraries in which this libretto, in this case, the actual 1711 edition, can be found. It lists Library of Congress. I believe Library of Congress since then has acquired the original version of it, since Sonic was published. But it also lists the performers and the singers, and that the singers also appear in a separate index. So you could actually search by singer to see in which operas they appear. So when cataloging librettos, you would follow the basic rules for cataloging books, and in particular for cataloging plays. Again, most of us who catalog music may have limited experience or limited exposure to cataloging books, but the approach is very much like cataloging a play. So the literary form in the 08 field would be D for dramas. And you can have a subject analysis using form divisions, dramas. So we looked at Daphne. We can use Daphne the nymph dramas in a subject in 650, Julius Caesar in a 600, Puritans for Puritani Tuberculosis for just about any late 19th century opera would be appropriate to use, et cetera, et cetera. So mandatory operas, subfield V librettos, pretty much is the standard. You should not subdivide by century if you're adding the libretto as a form. Optional, again, if these are things that you normally do, you could also use a 380 or a 655-7 for the format. When classifying librettos, now I'm talking about LCC, it gets especially complicated, perhaps unnecessarily complicated, but this is what Library of Congress will do. ML48, ML49 is pretty straightforward. 2 or more composers or librettists for that one publication, 1 composer or librettist for that publication. ML50 is for non-US imprints published after 1801 and US imprints published after 1851. Cutter by composer, not librettist, but by composer, and subarranged by title. ML 50.2 is for early non-US imprints. In this case, you cutter by title, not librettist, not composer, title, subarranged by composer or librettist. ML 50.6 for US imprints before 1850, again, cuttering by title, subarranged by composer or librettist, and then ballad operas, like the Beggar's Opera, which you would then cutter by title and then by year. Ballad operas, usually you have any number of composers picking up songs from different sources, so it wasn't necessarily one composer writing the music to it, which is why you wouldn't necessarily subdivide by composer. Now, is that useful to have all of your librettos sorted this way? Again, it depends on whether you believe in the joys of browsing and coming across things. Again, you could potentially be splitting up your libretto collection based on when the thing was published. So if you have an I Puritani from 1837 and you have an I Puritani from 1937, they would not have the same classification. So if you think that's a little strange, at least in my previous position at Northwestern, all librettos were classified under ML50 for ease of shelving and for logic. So, you know, I think that there's a rationale for that. It makes some sense that you may not want to go that deep into the differences. But again, we're also talking about publications before 1850. So these may not be in general in your collection, but might be in the special collections. Now, it reminded me of something that that Damien was talking about in the Ask Everything group, which was going through old cataloging rules and trying to determine why we do the things that we do. So the history of main entries for librettists is, I found, a particularly interesting topic. So prior to 1941, the main entry for a libretto was the librettist. And this is what we find in the 1904 edition of Rules for a Printed Dictionary Catalog. The music section was supervised by Sonic himself, in which the rule is librettos under the librettos enter under librettist with added entry for composer. Pretty straightforward. In 1908, enter a libretto under the librettist if known, otherwise under the title. In either case, make added entry under the composer. Again, very straightforward, makes some sense. Then came the ALA catalog rules, author and title entries of 1941. And allow me to read them. A libretto that bears evidence of association with a particular opera or other musical work is to be entered under the composer of the music with added entry under the librettist. That is, the main entry is to be made under composer if the composer is named on the title page or elsewhere in the published work, or if, no composer being named, there is reference to a particular performance, and the composer of the music for that performance can be ascertained. If there is no mention of composer or of performance, the libretto is to be treated as a literary work and entered under the librettist. Wow, I find that just so fascinating. That there was this change in mood, this change in approach when it comes to the main entry. Why would this be? I don't know for sure, but I have a strong feeling that this goes to that question of collation. Do we want to be able, and then of course at this time we're talking about printed cards, do we want to be able to search for our librettos under the name of the librettist who may not be as well known to us, or do we want them to be listed under the composer who is probably more famous than the librettist, probably more famous than the librettist? But look at what I love about this rule is the extent to which they are telling you to do the research to find that composer. Please let there be a mention. If there isn't a mention of his name, please let there be a mention of the performance so that you can tie the performance to the composer and then have the composer's name as the main entry. I just love the urgency behind that rule. And this was pretty much true in the original AACR. Pretty much that rule, slightly modified, pretty much was that rule. And then came AACR 2. AACR 2 says that librettos are considered related works in 2128. And the general rule for 2128 is to enter the related work under its own heading. Now, related works aren't all music, but examples include incidental music and cadenzas, which makes sense. So if someone writes the incidental music to, let's say, Shakespeare, to Midsummer's Night's Dream, do you want the incidental music to that score to go under Shakespeare, or do you want it to go under Mendelssohn? Makes sense. Likewise, for a cadenza, when another composer writes a cadenza for a famous concerto, that cadenza, the main entry, is the composer of the cadenza, not the composer of the concerto. Makes some sense. So there seemed to be and I should also say that related works, in terms of the relationship, it does seem to feel like it is a lesser relation. So it is not a relation that is equal on both sides. A related work means that the main work to which is a related work. So the libretto is considered a related work to the opera, which is the main work. They're not reciprocal relationships. However, in AACR 2, there is a footnote, footnote 7, which provides an alternate rule to 2128B1 for librettos. Enter a libretto under the heading appropriate to the musical work. Remember, this is a relationship. The musical work, that is the composed work by the composer, musical composer. Make an added entry under the heading for the librettist. If the libretto is based on another text, make a name title added entry under the heading of the original. If, however, a libretto is published without reference to its musical setting, enter it under the heading for the author of the libretto. So this is slightly different than the earlier rule that it needs to be not under the, wait, that is the same as the original rule. Yep, never mind, take that back. It is saying that it would go under the librettist. Treat it, in the earlier rule it said, treat it like a literary work, but it didn't feel like it needed to say that. The LCRI for 2128 apply the alternative rule. So we had a moment in which the librettos would go back to being under the librettist as the main entry, but then we had this alternate rule and we went back. Why? Again, we're talking about from 1941 to AACR2 and then the revisions into 1988. We're talking about 40 years of having librettos in our card catalogs and now in our electronic catalogs being under the name of the composer as the main entry. I think people were maybe hesitating to make that leap. So a typical AACR2 record. This is for the libretto for Rosenkavalier. Richard Strauss as the composer. We have a 240 for the opera subfield S libretto, and then an added entry for the librettist. Anyone who's cataloged under AACR2 probably seen this, very common. In this case, for this libretto, also published in 1911, except it does not name the composer. It just names the librettist. In this case, we have the librettist as the main entry and no entry for the composer. That would be following the strictest rule. If the performance is not named, if the composer is not named, there's no instruction to name him in this libretto. That would be following the strictest rule. Whether you like that or not, that would be following the rule strict. So let's go back to our Puritani example. Here, as we mentioned before, is actually has the original Italian text plus an English translation. So going back down memory lane for people who used to catalog with AACR2, you'll remember that you had in the 240 a subfield L for language, and boy, this brings back memories, having the translated language first, then the and Italian for the original language. Then we have the 245, the 246 for the parallel title. And then we list the librettist, Pepoli, Doca, who's the translator, and Grieve. I always think it's interesting whether we should actually have Grieve in this. I mean, he is named, but he's not directly related to the librettist or the libretto of the actual thing. So he is named on the title page. Is it appropriate to name him because his existence is specific to this performance? So I find that, I'm not sure. I mean, again, his name appears there, but not directly as related. In AACR2, I actually have less problem with having his name. RDA, I have more issues with it, but I'm willing to talk about it as we look at RDA. So librettists and composers are both defined as creators. Recording creator in RDA is 19213, and here is an example. Goodman Alice, authorized access point, representing the creator for Nixon in China, and it is describing a separately published libretto for the opera composed by John Adams. So here in the example, it is saying that the preferred creator of a separately published libretto should be the librettist. And here, when RDA became our standard, in this case, no exception was made. So now we went back to where we were 70 years prior. The librettist, once again, at the top of the record. In RDA, of course, we were just talking about relationship designators in the Ask Anything session. So we have a relationship for the creator with the work, and that is, of course, librettist and librettist of, depending on which way we're describing this, and the derivative work relationships. So a libretto based on, we mentioned that in the AACR2 example, and adopted as libretto is its reciprocal. And libretto for work, libretto work. So that is how you would then have an entry for an access point for the opera itself. That is the opera. For the musical work, that is the opera. So if I were going to catalog this under RDA, I would have librettist following as a relationship designator following the name of the librettist. And I would have a 700 libretto for work, and then the access point for the Strauss opera. Puritani, as we said, it's a little more complicated because it is both, has the original Italian and an English translation. So again, Pepoli as the librettist, Tocca as the translator of the libretto. Grieve, still not feeling so good about him. Maybe he should be there, maybe he shouldn't, don't know. It really isn't a good relationship designator for him because from what I can see, and I might, someone could correct me on this, but it seems like set designers, which is sort of what he is, that relationship designator refers to movies, motion pictures, not to stage performances. So, he's a contributor to some degree. But again, is it appropriate given the context of libretto? Not sure, but there it is. It contains the work, which is Puritani. It also contains the expression, which is the translation of Puritani into English. It is a libretto for the Bellini. And this one, again, not entirely sure, but I kind of like it. That is also the libretto for the expression of Bellini's opera sung in English. There's always this thing, and it's true for all examples of vocal music, that even if the text is created by a creator, there is still in vocal music an acknowledgement, an agreement, an understanding, I guess it's the best word for it, an understanding that musical works that are sung can be translated even if within the context of the music, not separated from the text. So is it the libretto for the Puritani in English? Maybe. I'm not sure that the text was meant to be sung, which makes it interesting, as opposed to, let's say we had a sound recording of Puritani sung in English, and then we had the words that were actually the ones that were sung. Would that be different than whether this is? I don't know, but I thought it was an interesting access point, so wrote in there. See what you guys all think. Then, now I'm going to talk a little bit. So we've been talking about bibliographic records. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about authority records. So if for the variant access point, there is a rule in RDA specific to librettos, 627.1.4, which says to construct a variant access point representing one or more librettos, lyrics, or other texts that have been used in specific musical works by combining the authorized access point for the work, the musical work, the term libretto, and an other distinguishing term as needed. And this is what that would look like. Does this look familiar? Yes, it looks exactly what you would have done under AACR2, but now it is being described as a variant access point specific for librettos. I can't think of any other examples, and again, people who know RDA better than I can't think of any other examples where you actually have the instructions within RDA. It's not even that it's a policy statement, but within RDA saying you should follow a pattern that only made sense in the previous cataloging standard, because this doesn't make sense in our current standard to have libretto. It was just following that previous one. Now, why would we do this? Well, one logical reason to do it is because of the way our systems work. There's an assumption that if you had this, then all you would need to do is do a little computer switch around, and what used to be a 100 field in your authority record is now a 400 field. And wouldn't that make things easier to flip? I can't say that, I mean, that was actually in their minds when they threw this in. Again, there may be some people who worked on this one. Would love to hear from. But it's interesting that we actually took a rule from AACR2, made it a variant access point, when, again, there's no real standard for why you would do this, as opposed to, as I said before, saying this is libretto for and this. That would be make more sense to me. Why would you need this second additional variant access point that mimics the old system? So I find that interesting. So here's what an authority record might look like for Alice Goodman's Nixon in China. We have a 380 for librettos, the 400 as instructed in RDA. I have also thrown in the some 500 for Alice Goodman as the librettist, as well as libretto for work, Nixon in China. And here's an example that I did for Wagner. In Wagner's case, when the librettist is the same as the composer, you do not add an additional 400 for Wagner Parsifal subfield S libretto. This will suffice, but I have librettist as Wagner, libretto for Parsifal. And then a little note about 1877, which is fine. In conclusion, I'd like to share this wonderful quote about librettos. I find that it's very interesting that, you know, libretto, in terms of cataloging librettos, you have to think both of the libretto as text, as well as thinking about the libretto as object. Both of these things, both of these terms operate at the same time. We need to consider both aspects of the libretto when we are cataloging them. I find it, again, very interesting that especially the early librettos are really windows into what performance practice, what it meant to be a member of that audience and the information that was being shared with that audience, which we can now take back 100, 200 years later, that we can learn about the musical culture of those times. So I just find this topic very, very interesting, and I hope you all did too. So, exactly at 45 minutes as I had hoped. So thank you all for your attention, and Kevin, let's try with the questions.
Yep, let's try with the questions. All right. No, that was great, Morris. Thank you. I'm trying to track the questions here, and we have a couple of people who will help me with this. I copied and pasted a bunch of them into a document just so it would scroll past my face. Okay, so let's see. There were some comments. There are a lot of comments. People giving advice and things. Frank, should I say your name, Frank? I guess I already did. Sorry. Frank says sometimes librettists allow composers to change text into the libretto as the music is being composed, or even being before a composition process begins. Generally, the composer does not receive credit as a co-writer of the libretto. Just to comment, this might complicate the authorship of the libretto. Do you have any comments on that, Morris?
Well, it kind of reminds me of the Lennon-McCartney debate, right? So I think there's the information that we take from the libretto itself, which may or may not be complete on purpose as to who contributed what. Again, I think that when it comes to, what it is that a cataloging record is supposed to do in order to inform people, of course, if we have information that would indicate that the composer contributed to a greater degree than what would be expected from a composer, then we could add that information in a note and then give the composer an additional RD as librettist. But I do think one of the problems would be to the degree, and again, is it a problem? I don't know. But when you're creating the authority record for the work, for the libretto as a work, would you then want to name the composer as in a variant access point also as a composer? Because would that sort of complicate things? Because now you have the libretto as a work and the composer's musical work as a work, and then it might be some naming convention problems.
All right, thanks. Let's see, I'm going to move. We have a question. Do these practices apply to heavily annotated, descriptive, or illustrated libretti?
No. I don't know. You mean by heavily illustrated, you mean added illustrations, or that is after the fact, that is manuscript illustrations, or that the libretto was published with illustrations?
I don't know. That was the question. So we'll just, if the person after the fact.
Well, again, I think it depends. I think it depends on how you're going to catalog it. So if you're going to approach it essentially as a manuscript that uses a libretto as the source paper upon which you are illustrating it, then you're cataloging something very different. But if you're cataloging a libretto and then additionally writing about the added illustrations, I would think that most of the things that I said would follow.
All right, thanks. I'm stealing your screen back just so we can see you.
Yeah, I didn't know if I'd wanted to see a slide, but
Okay, let's see. The next was just a comment from Damien regarding the LC class stuff with the 50.1, 50.2 thing. He says the LC classification.
Defend your people, Damien.
Yeah, defend your people. Now it says the LC classification for M was developed to solve certain problems in the early days of the music division. So this probably has more LC specific. This is probably more LC specific as opposed to something more broadly applicable to everyone else. And I think this kind of goes along with wasn't there ML 20 something? There's like collections of stuff in the LC class that just doesn't make any sense to anybody else outside of LC, right?
Just to explain,
31.
Just to explain very quickly, when Sonic became chief of the music division, he inherited about 100,000, not 100, about 10,000 items that were just sitting in piles all around LC. So the LC classification was really developed as a way to organize these things. Most of the things in the early days of the music division are not cataloged at all. They're just classed. So that's why you get a crazy classification like that collection one you mentioned. Because like, what do we do with these? Well, just stick them here. And stacks at LC used to be browsable. So if you told a patron a certain number, they could go leaf through it like you were at a music store.
All right.
So to go back to the Northwestern example, I think, again, there's some logic to depreciating some of these options that you have, again, to fit your collection.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Okay, another question. I think this is regarding the ML50 or whichever class system you chose, but cutter by preferred title or title as it appears, for example, in translations.
Damien will answer this question.
I don't know. You'd have to ask my team. It's been a while since I cataloged a Libretto, to be quite honest. I mean, it's whatever your shop is set up to do.
Chuck Carroll had an opinion.
Oh, where's that? I might have missed it. I think it's supposed, I mean, I think it would make more sense to do it under the uniform title, or what we used to call uniform title, because then they would put all of them together instead of having them spread out cuttered all over the place. That's just my personal opinion, and that's how I would do it on my own. Let's see. Okay, I think this is a question. Regarding 1941 code, did treatment as literary work equal classification outside of ML50?
Yes, it was a question.
Okay, you didn't put a question mark. So
I know, I got too wrapped up in the ellipse.
So are we classing literary works outside of the ML50 class?
Are we classing literary works outside the ML50 class?
Well, let me elaborate. There was a slide where and I think the 1941 code said to treat them as literary works. Now you can treat them as literary works in terms of whose name you put at the top, but do you also treat them as literary works in terms of classification? And I understand that the cataloging code doesn't care about classification, but I'm just kind of asking, and I will ask Damien then, have librettos always gone in ML50, or was there a time then they went into the P classes?
I'm sure that we have some librettos sitting in the P classes at LC. In fact, this confusion still exists in the sense that we'll get delivered to the music division playtext because they think, oh, it's a libretto. And so we'll have to reroute it on its way. So it's hard to say, we have hymn texts that exist that are classed in the BS classes, for example, or the B part of the classes, just because of how a lot of these practices have to be done how LC decided to do something at the time. So LC classification is not the most principled thing in the world. Let's put it that way.
And And I
Go
think
ahead.
we're also talking about past practice, right? So I think I agree with Damien that it's quite logical to find librettos that were cataloged 70, 80 years ago in a different place. And it does seem like the instructions say, if you really can't explain how this libretto is a libretto, I mean, it's essentially what the rule is saying, is that if you really can't find a connection to the musical work, then treat it as a play, which kind of makes sense. But again, if you're calling it a libretto, there must be some reason why you're doing that. but again, it's not unusual, especially for these early works, that they may not indicate, like I said, the earliest librettos don't always indicate who the composer was. So there may be limited resources for you to figure this out as to who the composer was, and you just would class it in the Ps based on the country of origin.
All right. There's just a comment on this that it makes sense. It says, as devil's advocate point of view, if you have a libretto that indicates the name of the librettist but not the composer and no indication that it was ever set to music, a cataloger who isn't familiar with operas might think it was simply a drama and catalog it as such. And that's, I mean, I've seen many, I won't say many, but I've seen libretti in the Ps, and you can't fix everything when you find them. So let's see.
You could again, logically, you could have someone write a libretto with the intention of having it set one day, but they didn't have someone that they were working with. So then where else would it go except as a dramatic work?
All right. Okay. I'm going to ask this one. I'm kind of backtracking through the things. Morris, would you care to comment on how to handle different performance information on title pages for librettos printed in the same year by the same publisher?
No. Next question. I'm not sure what it is that you're looking for.
I think it's more of a special collections, when you have different, it's obviously a different printing where the layout may actually be different, but the words are exactly the same. How do we account for that? And I think that comes out under the DCRM rules rather than.
Yeah, and I think it's the nature of a lot of music publishing, but including title pages for scores aren't always published the same over a period of time, or even within the same period of time. But to what extent do you think the title page makes a difference? If that's the only difference, is the title page.
It may not be, though. You'll find out that I guess if they had different numbers of pages, you would actually have a different catalog record. But you see the last page, and one of them has 2 lines on it, and the other one's totally filled, and they are both page 47. And what do you do with that? So, but I think that, like I said, I think that comes under the DCRM rules rather than a libretto cataloging rule. Someone mentioned that libretti with extensive annotations can have the subject heading of prompt books. Great. I don't know anything about that. I don't even know what a prompt book is.
If those are the nature of the annotations, sure.
Okay, here's a question. In some operas, like bel canto, words seem not so important, which might shift the main entry toward the composer. Do you notice this in libretto publication?
I don't know. There's one interesting genre of the pasticcio opera, which takes music from any number of composers and sort of cobbles a story together based on these songs that existed from, in many cases written for other operas that were put together. And so, in those cases, the librettos often say music by various great composers, but don't actually name who the composers were. So I'm not sure that I can think of, again, maybe you're thinking of a specific example of where the librettist was so diminished that that the composer was so predominant of the work that there would not have been a librettist known, or at least indicated in the publication.
All right, I don't see any more actual questions. There's lots of comments in the chat, and I'm scrolling through them, but we are at time at this point. It's 3:15, so I think we're going to end the session. I want to thank Morris for this great presentation, the history of cataloging libretti and what we do now. So thank you, Morris. At this point, if you have any further questions, I'm sure Morris will let you email him, or you can find him if he goes to the Gather. You can talk to him there. We are going to have a half-hour break right now, and that will be in the Gather platform, or you can just hang out here. I'm going to be staying in the Zoom room, although I'll turn off my mic and everything. And then we'll be back at 3:45 for our last round of lightning talks and finish up this whole darn meeting. So have a good break. I will see you all in a half hour.